What's up, nerds? Welcome back. Today I'm talking about one of the most highly anticipated books of the year that's coming from the thriving Spawn universe right now. That is Gunslinger Spawn #1. Alright, so if you're like me and you've been keeping up with what's going on with the Spawn universe in the comics, you will know that it's chugging along very well, very successfully. It's doing very good. One thing that is of concern is not even with the comics, it's with the movie that, Todd has been trying to get made for like, what, 20 years now? That he's now gotten onto this point where he's starting to look over scripts for the potential movie, and he's said that a lot of them he rejected just because the majority of them were wanting to retell the actual source material, and he had a problem with that because apparently he's the only one who would have an issue with a movie that is actually faithful to the source material. Yeah, so apparently that's a problem for Todd. I don't know. And then on top of that, he's also wanting like an actual black person's input, because as you will remember, Al Simmons is a black character, so he wants like authentic experience, because as a white guy from Canada, he doesn't think that he can be empathetic enough to tell somebody else's story. He needs to make sure that he's telling the right type of story. So we got all of that shit in there, which is just, it makes one concerned. You know what I mean? It seems like he's focusing on all the wrong shit that everybody else is saying, like, why are you worried about that? Like, how about you just don't do all of what you did in the first movie? And here's the thing. I didn't even hate the first movie all that much. Like, I really didn't. The animated series was leaps and bounds better than that. But, I mean, it wasn't so terrible. It just tried to do... I don't even really know how to describe it. It tried to do too much, while at the same time, it tried to be very technically and visually stunning, which for the effects of the time, I guess it really didn't even succeed that well in that. But I mean, that's where I'm saying, like, they were trying to focus too much on that, on trying to make the movie look flashy and visual and cool and shit like that. So now it feels like Todd is trying to do the complete opposite of that, almost, where it's like he thought we saw too much of Spawn. And I remember one time he was talking about, Spawn in the next movie, he's just going to be more like the boogeyman. Like, you're never really going to see Spawn. He's just always going to be like that shadow that's following Al. I was like, that's a stupid-ass idea. So hopefully he doesn't go along with that, but at least the comics are doing well. So let's kind of get into what's actually going on with Gunslinger Spawn, because it's not particularly any one story. I think there are like, what, 3 actual stories in here? If I'm not wrong. Wait, 4. There are 4 stories in here. So we start out with the main one. If you've read Spawn Universe, then you know that what happened was Gunslinger Spawn got transported into the future. And so we see where we're picking up from that, where he goes and he's also talking to Al Simmons, like the actual Spawn, who's saying, because he tells him, like I said, I had my own reasons. And Spawn tells him, I'm sure you did. I need to know why. What drew you to that island? Because as far as I know, you're new to this entire planet. So why that place? But anyway, he goes and hops on his motorcycle that apparently he had just hidden. So he takes off on it, and then he keeps going, but, he runs out of gas. So that's what ends up happening to him. And he has to find some way to fix that, because being that he's from, like, I don't know, what, the 1800s or some shit, he doesn't actually understand how this shit works. So he has no idea why it just stopped working. But that takes us over to our next character, who is this kid. I think his name is, what? Taylor. So he's working at this, like, store, basically like an auto body shop, and his boss is saying, like, he's leaving, and he's telling him, like, make sure you lock up and all this shit. So he doesn't really care. He's not paying that much attention. But then after his boss leaves, his friends show up and tell him, like, yo, we're gonna go, like, party and have some fun for a while. So he's like, all right, yeah, I'll go with y'all. So he goes and he's drinking and shit. He's hanging out with his friends. And then eventually they, like, bring him back to work. So he's getting there, and it says, he thought he locked everything up, but what he sees sobers him in a flash. So he's like, sweet mercy. Because he sees the bike, and it's apparently the bike of his dream. So he goes up, and he's, like, looking at it and shit, when all of a sudden Gunslinger Spawn walks up on him and, like, holds a gun to his face. So he says, put your hands where I can see them. You understand me, boy? He says, you got a name, son? And he tells him, like, it's Taylor. So he says, that a first or last name? He says, first. My last name is Bartlett. And he says, then, Taylor Bartlett, I'm going to ask your scrawny ass a few questions. That okay with you? And he's just like, sure. So he asks, he asks him, first, you know something about that contraption that won't work? And he's like, your motorcycle? Well, I mean, I'll take a look, but it seems fine. So after he looks at it, he's like, dude, you're just out of gas. So that immediately just pisses off Gunslinger Spawn. He's like, don't mess with me. What's gas? So, I mean, that was kind of goofy because, like, even back in his day, they would have known what gas was. It just wasn't like this type of thing. It would have been more like the type of thing you used to light lanterns and shit like that, you know? They did have gas technology back then. Anyway. So that takes us over to this other group of people who are plotting, because I guess they kind of know about what's going on. So this angel over here is making this deal with them, basically telling them, gentlemen, I appreciate you coming here on such short notice, and I'm hopeful that because of Cogliostro's actions, we'll be able to find a common purpose for both our cartels. And I believe that purpose, as we've talked about, begins with the hellspawn called Gunslinger. So he says, so if you're willing to call a truce between our factions, Cyrus, my boss will be more than happy to make sure that after he gets what he wants, Gunslinger is in no position to resist joining your side. A gift like that could go a long way to improve, from what I hear, is a frayed relationship with your own leaders. So he's just basically telling him, like, all right, yeah, I can handle them. What about your boss? When do we meet him? And he says, soon. He's planning to go public in a fairly significant way. For now, he's letting a family member take the reins. So that's where we go back over to Gunslinger Spawn, who's still with the kid and everything. And he says, you're telling me that if I figure out these gas station tires and highway things, I can keep traveling? He's like, well, yeah. You've got enough horsepower in your bike. And he says, I know the power of a horse. He's like, not that. I'm talking about a motor. Jeez, you're worse than my dad. Like some boomer with Alzheimer's. What's your deal? And he says, there is no deal. I'm from someplace else. Just trying to figure a way back there. So he tells him, I get that, but if you don't understand something, look it up. Google it. So, of course, he asks him, what's a Google and everything. So he shows him what Google is and all that shit. So then he tells him, I'm looking for a place called Twin Buttes, because that's where he's trying to get to. And he's like, dude, are you serious? Like, that's literally where you are. So he says, you're here already. This huge sign wasn't big enough for you? Because... yeah, I mean, you couldn't read this. I'm pretty sure he would be able to read, at the very least. Anyway, so he's like, you can't read this, can you? And he just tells him, no. So, apparently I was wrong. Anyway, so, he says, how have you survived your whole life without... and then he, like, pulls out a gun and he's like, this is how I survived. So, I mean, hey, you know, on the Wild West and all that shit, like, with all these weapons, yeah, that's probably the best way to survive. Anyway, so he says, always got protection. Want to know why my hat's so tall? Got protection in there, too. And he just pulls out this fucking, like, Bowie knife. So, I mean, pretty badass. I will respect that. The man carries a knife in his damn, like, 10-gallon hat and all that shit. So, good for you. So he says, ain't my only knives. Want to see? He's like, no, that's okay. Should I be scared now? He says, not if you're not one of them. But let's get back to my riding machine. Can you get it started for me? He's like, yeah, I told you I can. But if you want to go even faster, I've got some equipment in my dad's garage that could tune that puppy up a bit better. So he's like, perfect. We're riding to your house then. He's like, what? He's like telling him like, no, we can't do that or whatever. And he starts telling him like, my dad says I'm not allowed to come home unless he tells me I can, or he comes and picks me up. But before they can continue the conversation, all of a sudden this angel swoops in and just like tackles Gunslinger Spawn into the like house or whatever the hell, or the garage. So they immediately start fighting, and the angel's saying like, I told them you wouldn't hide. You're too stupid to know any better. But you're going to find out God's warriors have evolved in the past 200 years, and you're half the man Al Simmons is. So that immediately sets us off into this like fight between Spawn and Angel, which I mean is always pretty fun. So he starts shooting at him and shit. He uses his wings to block the bullets. And then he tries to come in for the attack and everything, saying like, how dare you defile my wings and all that shit. So as like Taylor's watching all of this, all of a sudden he sees where Gunslinger Spawn literally shoots the angel through the damn head and shit. And then he tells Taylor, like, get your ass back here. So he's like, yes, sir. I was just bringing your hat back. That's all. So he says, thanks. Mighty kind of you. Here, hold this. And he, like, tosses the gun to him and shit. So, of course, Taylor's just like, ah, shit. So he's like, what are you doing? Isn't he dead already? He's like, he is. But then we can see where he's literally, like, tying his fucking neck to the pole with what looks to be barbed wire. Or no, just like a chain. Something like that. He says, but you need to learn something. I want to teach you how to kill an angel, especially the dark-winged ones. There's only a couple ways. Watch. So he like starts shooting him in the chest, and he's telling him like, yeah, you can shoot them like that as much as you want. That's not actually going to kill them. If you really want to kill them, you got to shoot them through the head. So this is where he shoots him again through the head. And he says, although sometimes that won't actually be, you know, foolproof. So you're also going to have to use some other alternative methods. And then he like literally throws 2 daggers into the dude's forehead. And he just tells him like, yeah, don't forget, the forehead is where you need to aim. So after he does that, he tells him like, want to give it a try? But Taylor's just like, nah, I'll pass. So he's like, all right, suit yourself. Oh yeah, their bodies dissolve minutes after you kill them, so you don't even have to clean up your own mess. God wants to make sure humans don't know about all the crap he's up to. So he's saying that while the body's like disintegrating into like light. So he goes and says, now let's get some gas, as you called it, and get you home. So they take off back to Taylor's house, and then when they finally arrive, like Taylor goes running up into the door and shit, and as soon as he opens the door, his dad is standing there surrounded by like angels and shit, and he's like, what the fuck are you doing here, you idiot? I told you you're never supposed to come home unless I tell you you can. So that's when the angels tell him like, we know he's your son, but we can't have any human knowing we're here. So he's like, yeah, well, the dad's like, yeah, I know. So he's like yelling to his dad to help him. He says, I'm sorry, Taylor, this is your fault. You've got no one else to blame but yourself. So he's like still begging, and then we leave off on this particular story where Gunslinger Spawn comes running up, ready to fight all of the angels. So pretty nice setup for the first story, I'm not going to lie. So then we get into the second story, which is just kind of like a little bit scatological. It's this thing where he's in town and they're talking about like this woman has had her sons taken, and she's saying like, what? They've done no harm to no one. Why would they take my boys? She says, why? Who'd do something that cruel? And then they say, word is the Bartlett gang was involved. We posted a reward, hoping that'll help. So he goes searching for her sons and everything, and I'm assuming these are her boys. I'm not entirely certain. It's a little bit confusing. You'll find out why. Because, like, he cuts down the bodies, and then he, like, digs these shallow graves or whatever. And then it's saying, what? The only thing left to do is making sure the family of these dead men know what happened here. So this is where he goes into this, like, little house or whatever and finds this man who I'm assuming is their dad. And so he's saying, like, outside savage barking disturbs the serenity of the man inside. Then suddenly the dogs go mute. So he comes in, like, points a gun to his head and says, I want to show you something. But the guy says, you've made a fatal mistake, stranger. My men are all over this place. He's like, not anymore. It's just you and me, Bartlett. So if you remember, that's Taylor's last name, Taylor Bartlett. Anyway, so he's asking, like, where are you taking me and all this bullshit? But it's saying, like, Gunslinger Spawn hasn't actually said a word since they mounted up and took off. He's waiting until they actually arrive where they get to. So he says they now have. He says, your boys kill folks because of land and who owns it. It's why they hung the Sutton boys, who I found the other day. Thought you'd like to see the results of those actions. So that's where we see, like, he had tied, like, the ropes and shit to them, or still had the ropes tied to them, and then he pulls them out of the, like, shallow graves and shit. So the dude's, like, looking at him, he's like, oh, shit. He's like, my God, Jimmy, William, Tim. He's like, that's right. Look at your sons' faces. What you're feeling is exactly what Mrs. Sutton will feel when she learns about her own boys. He says, stay if you want. I'm done here. So he takes off, goes and finds the, like, wanted poster and shit and just, like, rips it in half. Kind of reminded me of Assassin's Creed. Remember when you used to have to, like, go and find, like, the wanted posters and tear them down? So that way it would, like, lower your notoriety level. Anyway, so we go on to the next story, and this one's about weapons. And it kind of just describes, like, how he makes his, like, bullets and shit. Where it's saying that he, like, came to learn from Cogliostro that the only way to actually kill some of the enemies that were coming at him was to, like, sacrifice a small part of himself, because that was the only way to actually make sure they would be killed. That, and he had to, if you remember, they have to be shot in the forehead. So it says the rest of the body didn't matter. In time, Gunslinger was able to apply that method to his arrows and knives, knowing at times a pistol or rifle wouldn't be available. And though he honed his skills over the years, in a cruel twist of fate, the more he protected himself, the weaker he became. Because the only ingredient, the only substance he could use to fortify his weapons was his own blood. The blood that contained his powers. So that's where we kind of see he's doing this whole, like, bloodletting process and then dipping the bullets into the actual blood. So gross, but I'm sure it's effective. Anyway, It says it puts him in a constant struggle of trying to balance how best to protect himself. Does he use his wits or a weapon? In the beginning, he had the luxury of choosing, but as more confrontations from things non-human piled up and the size of the attacking groups grew in scale, his only option was to make sure he was able to kill a dozen or more of them at a time. It meant guns, and it meant bullets. So that now, after years of battling, his powers are a fraction of what he'd begun with, which is why he'll do whatever is needed to keep himself alive. So he can't undo the single worst act he's ever done, one that's haunted his thoughts from the moment he did it, and he won't stop until it has been undone. At least long enough for him to figure out a way to get back to the 19th century. So that's where we see he heads out to hunt. And it even mentioned in that story too, that like this is weakening him, and that's really bad considering he's already the weakest spawn who has ever walked the earth. So that's not really the type of reputation you want, but it's the one he's got. So that brings us over to our final story here. And we see it starting out in this like little saloon and shit, where apparently there's this like one really bad guy who's in there. And he's just kind of like, he's one of those assholes who like everybody's just like, okay, if we just do what he wants, give him what he wants, he'll leave and just leave us alone. So he orders like another drink and everything. And the bartender sends his son over to like fucking serve it to him, and he's like insulting him, telling him like, tell your little half-breed not to spill a single drop of my shit and everything. So he comes over and he tells him like, seems like folks around here are going to let anyone come to this town, no matter the skin color. All right. Anyway, so he says that's a damn shame. So we see where he's like scratching something into the table and shit, and then the kid even tells him like, you know, you really shouldn't do that, it's not your table. And he's like, that's so. He asks him, like, how old are you? And the kid tells him, almost 12. So he's like, mighty young to have such a sharp tongue. So he, like, snatches him by the arm and shit. And then he tells him, you know what? Go back over to your dad. Tell him to serve me another drink. I want it full all the way to the brim. And you're going to rush that shit over to me as fast as you possibly can. And if you spill even a single drop, I'm going to raise all kinds of hell in here. So we asked him, like, do you understand me? And the kid says, yes, sir. He's like, good, now get going. And then he, like, tries to, like, the kid tries to walk away, but, like, he still has his arm. So he's like, you have my arm. Like, I can't move. So that's when we see this, like, just dagger thrown from off panel, and it cuts off a piece of dude's ear and shit before it lands into the wall. So that's where we see it's Gunslinger Spawn, of course. He's sitting there in the shadow looking like a badass with his gun and shit just sitting there. And then it's saying, like, the line is, because he says, let go of the boy. It says, the line is delivered with a stoic tone, meant not as a request, but as a command. Everyone in the room understands that, except for a single fool. So the dude is telling him, like, you just stepped into the wrong fucking person's business and shit. So he says, I said, let go of the boy. So that's where the bartender is saying, like, don't need any trouble now. Sheriff will be here soon enough. And then this dude is telling Gunslinger Spawn, like, the man I work for said you'd be hanging around here, Gunslinger. Says you've been poking your nose into matters you shouldn't, and you're pretty high on yourself. How about we settle this before any lawman gets here? So Gunslinger Spawn tells him, like, all right, well, you seem pretty hell-bent. I'll go ahead and let you shoot first. And the dude tells him, like, yeah, I was planning to. And then we see this gunshot. And then Gunslinger Spawn tells him, like, well, change my mind, because he shot him first and shit. So the dude falls down, Gunslinger Spawn walks up to him, and he's asking, like, where his boss is and shit like that. So the dude doesn't want to answer him at first, but he says, in the hills? That where he's at? And then he's like, starts stepping on his neck and shit. He's like, I asked you a question. So the dude's like, yes. And he's like, all right, cool, thanks. And then he just shoots him in the damn face as the kid is, like, standing there watching and gets some of the blood on his face and everything. And then the bartender saying, like, sheriff could have handled him. You didn't have to do that. He's like, maybe. But the sheriff wasn't here, and he was hurting your son. Someone has to protect him. So he goes and he takes the dagger out of the, like, wall and shit. He gives it to the kid, and he's telling him, like, you know, I'm sorry you had to witness all of that or whatever. He's like, here, use this to defend yourself, but never use it unless you absolutely have to. So the kid tells him, like, okay. And then he says, I'm leaving now. You take care of yourself here. So as he's about to walk out, he notices the, like, symbol that the guy was carving to the table. And it says, the mark, the one being carved by the dead man. Gunslinger has seen it before. So he tells him, like, all right, enjoy the rest of your day, ma'am. Because there's, like, a woman in there, too. It says, it's a warning mark, announcing that an army of his enemies will soon be arriving. When they do, he'll be waiting. So that's where he walks out of the saloon and shit. And then we get this, if you'll remember, classic Spawn trope, the whole, like, countdown thing. So that's where we leave off on this for now. And I gotta say, like, each of these, when I got this and I saw how thick it was, I was like, my god, is this all, like, the same story? Like, that seems like they're trying to do a lot. But no, it's, you know, 4 different stories that are still self-contained enough to be entertaining in and of themselves, which is pretty good. And then of course you do have like the actual main story in the beginning with him in the future and everything, trying to figure out his way to get back to his original time. So it should be pretty interesting to see how that particular thing plays out, especially because I am really enjoying like this whole Spawn universe thing. It seems to be, you know, pretty well done so far. There have been a few missteps. Not everything is perfect. You still have like some eye roll moments in there, but for the most part, the story itself, the characters, the way that everything's being handled, it all just feels very fleshed out, very well thought out, and just, I mean, if they could drop some of the more annoying elements in there, then I'd probably be enjoying it even more. But that's not saying a whole lot, because I actually really do love this character. Not even just because, like, I've loved Spawn ever since I first knew what Spawn was as a little kid. But I mean, just on top of that, seeing, like, the character and the universe expanding in and of itself, it's really interesting to me. So I like it. I want to see where this is going to continue to go. And yeah, I don't even know what else. I don't know when the next issue is going to come out for this. Hopefully somewhat soon, especially considering like how much it is that they've actually started up here. I'm hoping it'll be soon, but we'll see. There's going to be plenty of Spawn content, you know, in the meantime, I'm fairly certain. So I'm not even sweating it. I hope to see more of it coming soon. But I think that's going to do it for me on this review. So I don't know if anybody out there has read this particular issue. Feel free to let me know what you think about it. What do you think of where, you know, the Spawn universe is going? How do you think it's going to play out? What are your thoughts on the movie, the potential movie that's been in the works for like, what, 20 years, like I said? So, I mean, yeah, just feel free to share any of that with me down below in the comment section. And if you enjoyed this video, then definitely like the video, subscribe, and make sure you are still subscribed. Share the video out if you would like, because I appreciate it so very much every single time. But if you're done here, then go and read a book. And if not, well, then I'll see you on my next video.